Bill Spencer had always understood the value of timing. Power, in his world, was never about force alone. It was about presentation, about choosing the precise moment when an action could be framed as generosity while functioning as control. When he handed Katie the Logan brand, he did so with a smile that suggested benevolence, even affection, as though he were restoring something that rightfully belonged to her. To anyone watching from the outside, the gesture looked almost noble. Bill, the magnate, the former lover, the man with resources beyond measure, appeared to be honoring family legacy. What few immediately grasped was that the gift was not an ending, but an opening, a carefully placed spark meant to ignite a fire he could later shape. Katie accepted the brand with a complicated mix of pride and unease. The name Logan carried weight far beyond fabric and trademarks. It was history, sacrifice, and identity woven together through generations of women who had fought to define themselves in worlds that preferred to define them instead. Holding that brand felt like validation, a long overdue acknowledgement of her vision and resilience. Yet beneath the satisfaction, something unsettled her. Bill's generosity had never been simple. Every gift he had ever given came with invisible strings, and Katie was acutely aware that she was stepping into a role designed not entirely by her own choosing. Brooke's reaction was immediate and visceral. The moment she learned of Bill's decision, anger surged through her not merely as jealousy, but as betrayal. The Logan name was not a commodity to be passed casually between hands. Least of all by a man who had married into their family and then spent years reshaping its dynamics to suit his own ambitions. To Brooke, Bill's move felt like an intrusion into sacred territory, an attempt to redefine legacy through authority rather than lineage. Her fury was directed at Bill, but it found its sharpest edge in Katie, the sister who had accepted what Brooke believed should never have been offered in the first place. The argument that followed was not about business alone. It was about identity, about who had the right to carry the Logan name forward and what that right truly meant. Brooke accused Katie of allowing herself to be used, of stepping into a role that threatened the family's unity. Katie bristled at the implication, reminding Brooke that she had spent much of her life living in the shadow of others' choices. Her own contributions minimized or overlooked. The brand, she argued, was not Brooke's to guard alone. It belonged to all of them, and perhaps it was time that truth was reflected in reality rather than rhetoric. As their conflict deepened, both women began to notice unsettling patterns. Bill's presence lingered too comfortably in their disagreements, his words echoing in moments of doubt, his influence shaping conversations he was not physically part of. Katie replayed past interactions, recognizing how often Bill had framed his involvement as support while subtly steering outcomes in his favor. Brooke, too, recalled instances where Bill had positioned himself as protector of the Logan legacy, even as his actions consolidated power around himself. Slowly, uncomfortably, a realization began to take shape. The rift between them had not arisen in isolation. It had been encouraged, perhaps even engineered. The confrontation that followed was raw and exhausting. Accusations gave way to reluctant admissions as both sisters confronted the possibility that they had been maneuvered into opposition. The idea that Bill might be using the Logan brand as a means of control forced them to reassess not only their conflict, but their understanding of him. Bill thrived on division. It allowed him to present himself as indispensable, the mediator, the benefactor, the one constant amid chaos. Recognizing that pattern was both painful and clarifying. It reframed their rivalry not as a personal failure, but as a strategic vulnerability exploited by someone who knew them too well. Katie was the first to voice what both were thinking but neither wanted to admit. Protecting the Logan legacy, she said quietly, might require setting aside their grievances, at least temporarily. The suggestion tasted bitter, heavy with irony. An alliance forged not from trust but from necessity carried inherent risk. Katie knew Brooke would doubt her motives, just as she herself questioned Brooke's willingness to share control. Yet the alternative was worse. Allowing Bill to continue manipulating the brand would ultimately strip both of them of agency. Brooke hesitated, torn between pride and pragmatism. Agreeing to work with Katie felt like conceding ground she had fought to hold for years. Trust did not come easily, especially when wounds were still fresh. Yet Brooke understood the stakes. Bill's interest in the Logan brand was not sentimental. It was strategic. If he succeeded in positioning himself as its ultimate authority, the family's legacy would become another asset in his empire, subject to his priorities rather than their values. With visible reluctance, Brooke agreed to collaborate, her consent tempered by vigilance and unresolved resentment. Their alliance began cautiously. Conversations were measured, every suggestion scrutinized for hidden agendas. They revisited contracts, traced financial decisions, and reconstructed the timeline of Bill's involvement with meticulous care. What emerged was a portrait of calculated influence. Bill had structured his gift in a way that granted him leverage under the guise of generosity, embedding conditions that ensured his continued presence in decision-making. Each discovery strengthened their resolve while simultaneously fueling fresh arguments about responsibility and foresight. Unity did not erase their differences, it merely forced them into closer proximity. As they gathered evidence, the dynamic between Katie and Brooke evolved in unpredictable ways. Moments of shared outrage fostered brief solidarity, reminding them of their common roots and values. Yet old patterns resurfaced just as quickly, disagreements flaring over strategy, tone, and trust. Brooke worried that Katie, still entangled emotionally with Bill, might falter at a critical moment. Katie resented the implication, insisting that her clarity about Bill's manipulation was precisely why she had proposed the alliance. Their collaboration became a volatile balance of cooperation and conflict, powerful precisely because it was unstable. Bill, sensing resistance, adjusted his approach. He framed his involvement as concern, questioned their unity with feigned innocence, and subtly reignited doubts they struggled to suppress. His talent for exploiting emotional fractures remained formidable, and both sisters felt the strain of resisting him. Every interaction with Bill became a test, each conversation a negotiation between exposure and concealment. They knew that revealing their alliance too soon would invite retaliation. Yet secrecy carried its own risks, amplifying suspicion between them. Despite the tension, progress continued. Patterns crystallized, motives clarified, and the narrative Bill had constructed began to unravel. The sisters understood now that this was not merely a business dispute, but a battle over autonomy and identity. Protecting the Logan name meant reclaiming authorship of their story, refusing to allow it to be rewritten through manipulation. That realization imbued their efforts with a sense of purpose that transcended personal rivalry. Still, the question of sustainability loomed. Could an alliance built on mistrust endure long enough to achieve its goal? Or would Bill, with his intimate knowledge of their vulnerabilities, succeed in turning them against each other once more? Both Katie and Brooke grappled with that uncertainty privately, aware that the greatest threat to their plan lay not in Bill's schemes, but in their inability to fully trust one another. As they stood on the edge of confrontation, the stakes could not have been higher. Victory would mean reclaiming the Logan legacy and redefining their relationship on their own terms. Failure would cement Bill's control and validate his belief that division was inevitable. Between them stretched not only a plan to expose manipulation, but a fragile hope that unity, however imperfect, could prove stronger than the forces that sought to fracture it. Whether that hope would survive the coming reckoning remained uncertain. But for the first time, Katie and Brooke faced the battle with their eyes open, aware that the true measure of their strength would be revealed not in defeating Bill, but in resisting the temptation to defeat each other. The unraveling of Bill Spencer did not happen in a single dramatic instant. It unfolded the way all carefully constructed illusions eventually do, through accumulation, through small fractures widening into visible fault lines that could no longer be ignored. Katie and Brooke moved forward with a discipline born not of trust but of shared necessity. They learned to separate emotion from action, to keep their conversations precise and their disagreements contained. Every document they uncovered, every clause they traced back to Bill's influence, sharpened the picture of a man who had never intended to give the Logan brand away at all. He had only meant to reposition himself at its center, cloaked in generosity, shielded by sentiment. What finally tipped the balance was not a single piece of evidence, but the convergence of many. Financial trails revealed how Bill had quietly positioned holding companies to retain leverage over licensing. Emails, once dismissed as routine, exposed language that framed Katie not as an owner but as a steward, someone entrusted to protect an asset until it could be reclaimed under the right circumstances. Brooke recognized the pattern with sickening clarity. Bill had not merely manipulated contracts. He had manipulated perception, cultivating gratitude where scrutiny should have existed. Katie felt the betrayal even more acutely, realizing that what she had believed was empowerment had always been conditional. As their findings grew more damning, the sisters faced a final decision. Exposing Bill would mean public fallout, reputational damage that could ripple far beyond him. It would mean acknowledging their own misjudgments, admitting to the world that they had been outmaneuvered by someone they believed they understood. Yet silence would be worse. Allowing Bill to continue unchecked would mean surrendering the Logan legacy entirely, reducing it to another tool in his arsenal. The choice, once agonizing, became inevitable. They did not confront Bill privately. They understood that doing so would only allow him to reshape the narrative, to charm, deflect, and reassert control. Instead, they chose daylight. Regulators were alerted. Legal authorities were presented with meticulously organized evidence that revealed not only unethical behavior, but criminal manipulation, fraudulent misrepresentation, coercive control embedded in contractual structures, and deliberate intent to deceive. The case moved faster than Bill anticipated. His confidence, once unshakable, began to falter as doors closed and calls went unanswered. Bill sensed the shift before the arrest came. Power, after all, was something he understood intimately, and he could feel it slipping from his grasp. He attempted to reframe the situation, painting himself as a benefactor misunderstood, a man whose generosity had been twisted into accusation. But the narrative no longer belonged to him. When authorities arrived, the spectacle was unavoidable. Cameras captured the moment, freezing his expression in a mixture of disbelief and fury as he was taken into custody. For the first time in years, Bill Spencer was no longer directing events. He was being carried along by them. The public revelation of his actions was swift and brutal. Details emerged that stripped away the myth of the visionary mogul, replacing it with the image of a man who had weaponized intimacy and trust to maintain dominance. Former allies distanced themselves. Business partners issued statements of shock and dismay. The Logan brand, once a symbol Bill had sought to control, became the focal point of the scandal that exposed him. His charm, so effective in private, collapsed under the weight of documented truth. Katie watched the fallout with a complicated mix of relief and grief. Seeing Bill unmasked validated her instincts, yet it also forced her to mourn the version of him she had once believed in. She grappled with guilt, not for exposing him, but for having allowed herself to be drawn into his orbit so completely. The realization that her autonomy had been compromised not by force but by trust left scars that would take time to heal. Still, she felt a growing resolve. The Logan brand, reclaimed through painful clarity, now demanded stewardship rooted in transparency rather than fear. Brooke experienced the reckoning differently. For her, Bill's downfall confirmed long-held suspicions. But it also confronted her with the consequences of complacency. She had allowed familiarity to dull vigilance. Had accepted Bill's presence in her family's affairs because it seemed easier than challenging him. Watching him fall forced her to acknowledge her own role in enabling that dynamic. Yet alongside regret came determination. She refused to let the exposure of Bill's manipulation define the Logans as victims. Instead, she envisioned it as a turning point, an opportunity to redefine strength as collective rather than individual. The alliance between Katie and Brooke, forged under pressure, did not dissolve with Bill's arrest. If anything, it grew more complex. Without a common enemy to focus their efforts, unresolved tensions resurfaced, but they were tempered by shared experience. They had faced manipulation together and emerged intact. That knowledge changed the terms of their conflict. Disagreements still flared, but beneath them lay an understanding that division had nearly cost them everything. In the aftermath, the Logan brand stood at a crossroads. Rebuilding trust required more than legal victory, it demanded cultural reckoning. Katie insisted on restructuring governance to prevent future concentration of power. Brooke supported the move, recognizing that legacy could no longer rely on personality-driven authority. Together, they implemented safeguards that prioritized accountability, ensuring that the brand's future would not hinge on any single individual's influence. Bill Spencer, once omnipresent, faded from the center of their lives. His arrest did not erase his impact, but it diminished his power to define their narrative. In losing control, he revealed the truth he had worked hardest to conceal, that his strength had always depended on others' willingness to believe in him. Stripped of that belief, he became simply a man facing consequences long deferred. For Katie and Brooke, the victory was incomplete but meaningful. They had reclaimed the Logan legacy not through dominance, but through confrontation and collaboration. The question that lingered was not whether they had defeated Bill, but whether they could sustain the unity that had made his exposure possible. Trust, once broken, does not mend easily. Yet as they stood together in the quiet that followed the storm, they understood something essential. Power rooted in manipulation collapses when exposed. Power rooted in shared purpose, however fragile, has a chance to endure. The story did not end with Bill's arrest. It transformed. What followed would be shaped by choices still to be made, by whether the sisters could continue to choose alliance over rivalry, clarity over comfort. The Logan name, once a battlefield, now became a promise, one forged not in illusion, but in the hard-earned truth that legacy survives only when it is protected by those willing to face uncomfortable realities together.